One of the defining characteristics of criminal punishment is that it's meant to communicate a message of condemnation against those who violate a rule. This touches on the fact that there seem to be two types of penalties for violating rules, those that communicate condemnation and those that do not. Robert Blecker looks at this distinction in some detail in the article Penalties, Punishments, Prices, or Rewards. In doing so, he uses an analogy between criminal penalties and sports penalties to illustrate the difference. Blecker presents an illustrative example from sports. It concerns a rule that gives an American football team a certain amount of time to start the next play. The penalty for failure to start the next play before the clock runs out is to move the ball 5 yards away from the goal. Now, a question we can have at the start is, why does this rule exist? I'm going to guess that it's to speed up the game, which makes the game more entertaining, which makes it more profitable. In order to realize this end or goal, a rule is established. The reason for the penalty is to give teams an incentive to follow the rule. Otherwise, it's just a suggestion. How would the rule function without a penalty? If the rule simply said, start the next play in a certain amount of time, and that's it. This would make the rule more of a suggestion, one that can be readily ignored. Or in the words of the pirate Barbarossa from Pirates of the Caribbean, the code is more what you call guidelines than actual rules. If we change to criminal punishment, imagine if the rules against theft, rape, and murder did not come with any penalties. They were just included in a list of things that people shouldn't do. But there's no penalty to be paid if somebody were to do them. Rules seem to require some sort of penalty in order to get the players or the citizens of a community to take them seriously. Now let's return to football for a moment. Imagine that we have a team that's trying for a field goal. The kicker states that he has a better chance of making the shot if he could get a little further away from the goal. By breaking the time rule, the team will get a 5-yard penalty. So as Blecker describes it, quote, although now further from the uprights, their new spot actually decreased the angle for the kicker and made it easier to kick the field goal. The penalty for delay of game acted as a reward, end quote. Is it okay to break a rule when one can harvest a benefit? Now recall the analogy to criminal law. Imagine that somebody can profit if they break a law against theft or murder. And we're not talking about getting away with theft or murder. We're talking about a case in which the punishment is less than the benefit, where the punishment is worth it, or the punishment is actually useful in itself. Blecker writes about homeless people who commit minor crimes in the fall so that they can obtain a sentence that will allow them to stay in prison, where they can have, quote, 3 hots and a cot, unquote, during the winter months, before being released again in the spring. What we have here are two possible attitudes towards breaking a rule. An actual rule in the case of sports, or a law when we're talking about criminal penalties. There is the price attitude, where there's nothing wrong with breaking the rule. Breaking the rule simply has a price, which one is to figure into one's calculations as to whether or not it's useful or worthwhile to break the rule. And there is the punishment attitude, where breaking the rule is wrong in itself. It's something not to be done even if one can benefit. The harm in this case is intentionally inflicted on the grounds that the person who broke the rule performed a type of act that deserves the punishment. So let's go back to our example. A team can have a price attitude towards the rule requiring that the next play start in a given amount of time. If the team can benefit from breaking the rule, then one does so, pays the price, and doesn't do anything wrong. This is just a strategy. Or the team can have a punishment attitude. Delaying the game is wrong in itself in that it shows a disrespect to the audience and to the game. And the penalty is a deserved harm inflicted on those who would violate the rule. As we will get to later, the attitude that one takes towards a rule influences the possibility that one may violate it. Now consider the same distinction applied to the rule against theft. One can have the same two attitudes towards this rule. Now, assume that you share a house with a number of students, and you're looking for one more person to move in, to share expenses. You have an option. One person that you're considering has a price attitude towards taking things from other occupants. Any penalty is a mere price to be figured in when determining if taking from another occupant is acceptable or not. Another person has a punishment attitude. Taking from another member of the household is wrong in itself, and the penalty is an intentional harm inflicted on the wrongdoer. Would this influence your choice of roommates? This is not to say that there is a single correct attitude applicable to all rules. One of the points that Blecker argues for is that there are rules where the cost of breaking them is meant to be seen as a price. There's no wrong done in breaking the rule as long as one is willing to pay the price. For example, assume you must pay your property taxes by March 1st or you'll be assessed a $100 penalty. If you're willing to pay the penalty, there's no wrong in paying late. And there are other rules where the cost of breaking them is meant to be seen as a punishment, a deserved harm inflicted on anybody who would do such a thing. This distinction between a penalty as a price and a penalty as a punishment is reflected in another distinction found in the law. This distinction is known by the Latin phrases malum in se and malum prohibitum. Malum in se means bad in itself. It's wrong. Even if it's not prohibited, it's wrong. This concept is used in some arguments to explain why a certain type of act should be punished. Why punish rape? Because rape is wrong, and those who commit rape deserve punishment. The wrongness of rape doesn't come into existence because it's prohibited. It's prohibited because it is wrong. Malum prohibitum refers to things that are not bad in themselves, but bad because they're prohibited. Here's a way to understand the difference. The military establishes certain standards, for example, for military uniforms. If the military decides to change the color of its uniforms, that's fine. There isn't an intrinsically correct color. On the other hand, if the military decided to permit the rape and murder of civilians, it would not be the case of, that's fine, we can now murder and rape civilians. These things are bad in themselves. Changing the rules doesn't change that. We can judge the merit or demerit of the rules by the degree to which they match up with what is and is not wrong in itself. Research shows that children can actually grasp this distinction at a very young age. If a teacher says that it's okay to eat during class, then it's okay to eat during class. Sure. If the teacher says that it's okay to hit another student, is it then okay to hit another student? Most students recognize that it would not be okay. Prohibition on eating during class is malum prohibitum. A prohibition on hitting another student is malum in se. So we have these acts that are bad in themselves. Why do we punish people for performing them? There's two main families of thought on this. One is because the punishment provides people with another reason not to perform the action. The punishment adds to the cost, and thus gives people an incentive not to do it. And the other is because the person who would perform such an action deserves to be harmed in virtue of the wrongness of their actions. What about acts that are malum prohibitum? Let's return to the example of a rule that requires that a play be performed in a certain amount of time. There's no malum in se attached to this rule. It's created for a reason of speeding up the game and making it more entertaining. Because there is nothing wrong in itself, it's not possible to justify the penalty in terms of a harm deserved because one performed an action that's wrong in itself. So where are we? We looked at a distinction between a price attitude towards rule breaking and a punishment attitude. The price attitude doesn't view breaking the rule as wrong. It sees the penalty as a cost of doing business. The punishment attitude views the act as wrong in itself and sees its penalty as a harm inflicted on those who would perform the act because they deserve the harm. We looked at a distinction between two different types of wrong, known by the Latin phrases malum in se and malum prohibitum. An act of a type that is malum in se is wrong in itself, wrong even if there's no rule against it. If there isn't a law against it, then there should be. An act of the type malum prohibitum is wrong only because we have a rule against it. The rule that prohibits moving a rook diagonally on a chessboard makes that act malum prohibitum. Another thing that Blecker argues is that these are not mutually exclusive categories. Some things can be a little of both. Take, for example, stopping at a stop sign. The stop sign is put up not because of a failure to stop is wrong in itself, but to harvest the benefits of safer roads. Yet, it is not the case that it is permissible to ignore the stop sign if one judges it to be in one's interest to do so. This rule is a little bit malum prohibitum. You are to stop because there is a stop sign telling you to stop. And a little bit malum in se, assuming that the law makes driving safer. Showing a disregard for the law shows a disregard for the safety of others, which is malum in se. Mistakes can be made. It's possible to mistake a rule that is malum in se as malum prohibitum. A company that pays a $2 million fine for dumping hazardous chemicals on open ground instead of a $5 million cost for disposal, treats a rule against dumping as a price rather than as a punishment, and this misunderstands the nature of this particular rule. In fact, Blecker suggests that many people who end up in prison have made this mistake. They've taken the criminal penalty as a price, where the criminal act warrants no moral condemnation, but is only something not to be done if one wishes to avoid the cost, as opposed to seeing the criminal penalty as a punishment, a message that the type of act warrants inflicting intentional harm on those who perform it. Now, this brings up questions about the motive for obeying the law, because it's wrong or because one wants to avoid punishment. This is a question I have no room to discuss here, but hope to discuss in a future video.